Grandma had an affair with an old man in the village and got caught. My mother was so ashamed of her that she directly broke Grandma's legs. Later, Grandma lay paralyzed in bed, eating rice mixed with salt, and died of thirst. After Grandma died, her body became very heavy, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't lift it into the coffin. The village pastor, who presided over funerals, said that Grandma had grievances and that a grand ritual must be held to appease her. My mother was furious. She took a basin of gasoline and poured it directly on Grandma's body. "Old thing, I'll burn you to ashes. Let's see how you can cause trouble." Grandma is dead. According to the custom in the village, the body should be kept for 3 days before a ritual is held to put her in a coffin for a grand burial. But my mother didn't want to. She was ashamed of Grandma and wanted to bury her as soon as possible. My mother despised Grandma very much. Ever since Grandma was in her 60s, she would sneak out to sleep with an old man in the village. And after being found out, my mother had always wished for Grandma to die sooner. She only gave Grandma 1 meal a day, and it was dry rice mixed with salt. Eating this food would not make her go to the toilet, and it would also fill her stomach. The most important thing was that after a long time, people would die of thirst. After less than a week of eating this, Grandma's lips became dry, and her eyeballs were yellow and sunning, looking like she was dying. Before she died, she begged my mother to give her some water to drink. Her voice was dry, and she said, "Kion, I'm dying. I only ask for a sip of water before I die. My heart is like a fire, it's so dry and hot." As she was about to die, my mother also had some kindness in her heart, and she walked towards my grandma with a glass of water. Grandma mustered her last strength, stretched her neck, opened her mouth wide, and stared at the water in my mother's hand with piercing eyes. "Quick, quick, give me a drink." My mother suddenly poured the water in the cup directly on the ground, and she laughed so hard she couldn't stand up straight.
"You old thing, you still steal men at such an old age. You made me get laughed at by other women in the village every time I went to the river to wash clothes, and you still want to drink water."
"I wouldn't even give you my pee." Before Grandma could finish her words, she collapsed on the bed and died. When she died, her eyes were wide open, staring diagonally at my mother at the same angle. It looked very scary. But my mother was not afraid compared to the dead. She was more afraid of the gossip of the women in the village. Now that Grandma was dead, she was very happy. Since the dead were the most important, the women in the village would no longer laugh at my mother for her dead grandmother. At this time, my mother couldn't wait to wrap Grandma in a quilt and ordered me to get a thick hemp rope to wrap Grandma up and bury her in the back mountain. There's a grave pit in the mountain behind our house. This was dug by my mother a few days ago. She said that Grandma wouldn't last 2 days and would die soon. This old thing died a day later than I thought. My mother muttered happily as she wrapped the corpse. "She's still quite tough." I helped tie the knot and accidentally touched Grandma's arm. She had just died and her body was still warm. Couldn't help but say, "Mom, when old people in the village pass away, they have to keep the body for at least 3 days. Grandma just died and you're gonna bury her. It's unfilial." My mother slapped me directly on the face. "You little bastard. Didn't you smell the stink on this old thing?" I'm sending her to the ground early, letting her see the King of Hell early. Isn't that a good thing? I didn't dare to speak anymore. Just as Grandma was about to be rolled over and packed up, her body suddenly became heavy, as if it was filled with molten iron. She couldn't move at all. My mother thought I wasn't helping hard enough and glared at me fiercely. "If you don't work harder, I'll chop your hand off." I was terrified and used so much force that sweat poured out, but Grandma still didn't move. "You old thing, you caused trouble for me when you were alive. You're still causing trouble for me after you die, aren't you?" My mother noticed something was wrong. She frowned and raised her hand to slap Grandma's face. "Back and forth, let me tell ye, you couldn't get over me when you were alive, and you still can't get over me after you're dead." My mother put the rope around Grandma's neck. The other end of the rope was tied to the tricycle outside the door. After she tied it firmly, she stepped on the accelerator of the tricycle, and Grandma's body was slammed heavily on the ground and was dragged out of the door by the belt. Grandma was dragged so hard that the back of her head was rubbed bare and the ground was covered in blood, attracting countless black rats. At this time, the village's funeral director, Blind Tom, came over his face, very gloomy. "Kewin, what are you doing?" My mother said indifferently, "My mother-in-law is dead. Her body is heavy. I'm using a tricycle to drag her to the back mountain to bury her." "How can you do this?" Blind Tom hurriedly untied the rope around Grandma's neck, and he said angrily, "He just died, right? You're dragging her with a tricycle. You're insulting the dead. Aren't you afraid of retribution?" Before he finished speaking, his voice stopped abruptly. At this time, the mice in the house crawled out in droves following the bloodstains left by the back of Grandma's head. My mother was a little puzzled. Don't rats all fear light? Why would they come out in broad daylight for blood? Retribution is coming. Retribution has already come. Beads of sweat suddenly oozed from Blind Tom's forehead. Although rats are dirty, they are the most spiritual. They came out running because they smelled that your mother-in-law was about to turn into a zombie, into a fierce ghost. I was frightened by his words. Blind Tom was a very capable person. In his early years, he was not blind, but it was because a pregnant homeless woman came to the village. A homeless woman begged for food from the men in the village, but instead of getting food, she was tossed around by the men. As a result, she and the child in her belly were brutally killed alive. The homeless woman had great resentment in her heart, and after her death, she turned into a fierce ghost, killing many people. Blind Tom used all his life skills and set up a yin and yang formation to subdue the homeless female ghost. But one of his eyes was also blinded by the yin energy of the female ghost. Now Blind Tom said that my grandma was going to turn into a zombie and become a fierce ghost. I was very scared and couldn't help but ask Grandpa, "Tom, how can we prevent my grandma from turning into a zombie?" Blind Tom slowly said, "I will perform a 3-day and 3-night ritual for her. Maybe it can soothe her resentment. Do a ritual for this old thing who steals men. Does she deserve it?" My mother was angry. She ran to the kitchen, took a basin of gasoline used for tricycles, and poured it directly on Grandma's body. She poured it quickly and anxiously. As soon as she finished pouring the oil, my mother took out a lighter and lit Grandma's hair. "Old thing, I'll burn you to ashes. Let's see how you can cause trouble." I knew why my mom did this. She wanted to burn Grandma so she could save a coffin. But a strange thing happened. Grandma's body was wet, but no matter how the lighter was lit, her body wouldn't burn at all. My mother's face showed a bit of panic. She turned to look at Blind Tom. "How much does it cost to do this ritual?" As soon as she finished speaking, she immediately added, "If it costs too much, then I won't do it. Anyway, if the old thing turns into a fierce ghost and harms people, it won't just be me." My mother has always valued money very much. To her, money was more important than her life. Blind Tom shook his head. No money. Blind Tom returned to his house. He brought back yellow talismans, bells, red and white candles, and other objects, specially used for rituals. At this time, most people in the village knew that my grandma had died. They surrounded us in a circle and whispered to my mother, "Mary, your mother-in-law is dead. Why are you still letting her lie on the ground? Why don't you get her a coffin?" My mother was very impatient. This old thing did such a shameful thing. What does she need a coffin for? Everyone stopped talking, obviously agreeing with my mother's words. The women in the village were very strange. They usually liked to tell dirty jokes. But once they encountered a woman who couldn't stand loneliness and had an affair with a man, they would be particularly contemptuous. At this time, Blind Tom walked around my grandma and chanted, "I surrender to the upper Yuan mansion. The heavenly official bestows blessings. May you drop the Dao treasure and release auspicious light. Illuminate the heavenly path. May the wind and thunder of the dead be extinguished, and may this deceased be saved." After chanting for a while, he took out a roll of yellow cloth from his bag. He put the cloth in my hand and said, "Tom, the sun is shining brightly. Now your grandma can't see the light when she's dead. You cover her body from head to toe with the cloth now." Grandpa Tom might cover it with yellow cloth. I asked, "Don't people in the village cover the dead with white cloth?" Blind Tom patiently explained, "Yellow has always been the color used by emperors and other dignitaries. Covering your grandma's body with yellow will make her feel noble and resolve some of her resentment." I felt a little ridiculous for no reason. Grandma couldn't even get a sip of water before she died, but after her death she became noble and glorious. But I still took the yellow cloth and covered Grandma from her feet up. Just as I was about to cover Grandma's eyes, her suddenly looked at me sideways. Oh, I was so scared that I sat down on the ground. Blind Tom saw that something was wrong with me and asked me what was wrong. I said tremblingly, "Grandma, her eyes seem to have moved." Blind Tom frowned and said, "Quickly, cover her face with the yellow cloth." I didn't dare to move. Blind Tom sighed, "It's broad daylight. Now your grandma will definitely not turn into a fierce ghost and harm you." My mother was also a little impatient and shouted at me, "Hurry up or I'll bury you with your grandma." I could only bite the bullet and do as I was told. After the yellow cloth was covered on Grandma's face, the yellow cloth covering her mouth suddenly sank. It looked as if Grandma was inhaling towards the yellow cloth. To the same time, a dull giggling sound came. My face turned pale, and I stood up abruptly. "Mom, Grandpa, Tom, there's laughter coming from Grandma's mouth." My mother looked blank laughter. Why didn't I hear it? The corpse laughing. This is the prelude to turning into a fierce ghost. Blind Tom's face became even more gloomy. It seems that the ritual can no longer appease her resentment. He took out 5 7-inch black nails and put them in my hand, and he said, "These are soul-sealing nails soaked in black dog blood, Tom. You nail these nails to your grandma's eyebrows, palms, and insteps to ensure that she won't turn into a fierce ghost tonight." I did as I was told somewhat mummily. The 7-inch nails were hammered into Grandma's eyebrows one by one. Maybe it was my illusion, but every inch the nail went into Grandma's body. I felt the yellow cloth on her mouth sink a little more. Grandma, unsai, unweary Rupufuna. I shed tears and kept repenting and praying in my heart. I didn't want to hurt Grandma's body. But I had no choice. The dead are dead, but the living still have to live. As the nails went into Grandma's eyebrows, scarlet blood slowly flowed out. My whole body froze and I felt as if I had hammered nails into the body of a living person. Blind Tom stood behind me and patted me on the shoulder. Your grandma just died, not long ago. Her blood still contains oxygen, so the blood is red. This is normal. I could only bite the bullet and nail the other 2 nails into Grandma's palms. The remaining 2 nails were to be nailed to the back of Grandma's feet, but her feet were pointing straight up, which made them difficult to nail. Blind Tom told me to take a hammer and break the bones in Grandma's ankles. I smashed it several times and Grandma's feet were like withered flowers, tightly attached to the ground. Soon the sharp nail tips pierced through Grandma's soles, nearing Grandma to the concrete floor. After all 5 nails were nailed blind, Tom was obviously relieved. Your grandma will definitely not be able to turn into a fierce ghost and harm people today. Night fell quickly. Blind Tom lit a pair of white candles and then lit 3 sticks of incense. He looked at me and said, "Although your grandma is suppressed by the nails, the resentment in her heart has not dissipated. So tonight, we have to keep vigil for her." I panicked a little, Grandpa. "Tom, aren't you gonna keep vigil with me?" "Only when the closest people keep vigil for the deceased can the soul of the deceased be comforted." Blind Tom sighed, and his expression suddenly became serious. And he added, "Tom, you must remember these 3 things when you keep vigil tonight. First, never let any animals near your grandma's body. Second, the incense in the incense burner must not be broken. Once it burns out, you must immediately add incense to continue it. Third, your grandma's body has been nailed. No matter what sound she makes, then pay attention to it." After saying this, Blind Tom patted me on the shoulder. "Tom, do you remember these 3 things?" I nodded vigorously. I thought I could do it. But when Blind Tom left, I was left alone to guard Grandma's body, and I felt terrified for no reason. I couldn't help but shout into the room, "Mom, can you come out and accompany me?" My mother shouted angrily, "Don't bother me playing, Jean." Her roar actually made me feel a little warm. I knelt beside Granny's body and began to burn paper and pray. "Grandma, I know you've had a hard time, so you have resentment." I put the yellow paper into the brazier one by one and couldn't help but cry. "But Grandma, you can't blame Mom. She's also having a hard time. Dad died early. She alone has to farm and take care of us. She's also having a hard time." Thus, every woman who lived in this village seemed to have a hard time. They had to do a lot of work, and their only source of happiness was to tell dirty jokes when they were washing clothes by the river. My mother had always been one of those women, until the object of their ridicule became my grandma. As the night got darker and darker, I was burning paper and feeling a little drowsy when I suddenly heard an unbearable sound. It was exactly the same sound my grandma made when she was caught cheating. I shuddered and stared at the human-shaped grandma wrapped in yellow cloth in front of me. Her body was pinned down by 5 7-inch nails and didn't seem to move. Then, where did that sound come from? I perked up my ears and listened carefully, only to find that the sound was actually coming from my mother's room. But wasn't my mother playing mahjong? Moreover, she always regarded herself as a chaste woman and would never do such shameful things with men. My heart began to race, and I couldn't care less about Blind Tom's instructions to keep vigil, so I stood up and ran towards my mother's room. Her door was locked. I knocked on the door hard and shouted, "Mom, open the door." The door remained motionless. I had no choice but to run back to the window outside the house, grabbed the glass window and looked inside, and saw my mother drunkenly hugging a snake. I had never seen such a big snake. It was pitch black, as thick as a basin, several meters long, and its black body filled the entire bed. And at this time, the thick snake head, which was glowing with oil, was constantly drilling towards my mother's legs. "Mom!" I screamed in horror, slapping the glass hard. Mom, wake up." My mother was still lying on the bed, looking intoxicated and unaware. I couldn't care less, grabbed the wooden stick next to me and smashed the window hard. Crash! There was a crisp sound, and the glass window shattered to the ground. I slammed the stick from the window hard at the snake. "Get out, you beast. Get out of my mother." The snake suddenly raised its flat snake head. Its yellow eyes widened to the sides, staring straight at me. It looked as if it would stretch its neck, open its mouth wide, and bite my head off at any moment. My hands and feet began to go limp. Ooh. My mother finally woke up. Her face was contorted with tension. "Snake. What a thick snake." She quickly got up from the bed and tried to run out, but the snake's thick tail tightly wrapped around my mother's body, making her unable to move at all. My heart was anxious, and I shouted, "Help! Someone help!" as a snake wrapped around my mother. I wanted to call all the neighbors around to help drive the snake away, but my mother stopped me. Her whole body was tightly wrapped by the snake, but she still struggled to spit out a few words from her mouth. "Don't call anyone." "Mom, do you not want to live anymore?" "Me." Never. I didn't understand my mother's thoughts. I had already lost my grandma. I didn't want to lose my mother again. So for the first time in my life, I disobeyed my mother, ran to the neighbor widow Lisa's house, and knocked hard on the door. At least I get help. A snake is wrapped around my mother. Chizuze had a big gong in her hand. Every time something happened in the village, she would bang the gong with a stick, and after shouting a few words in a loud voice, everyone in the village would know. My grandma stealing a man was shouted out by Widow Lisa. When everyone in the village kicked open the door of my mother's room, the big snake was gone. And my mother wasn't wearing any clothes. Her hair was messy. She is holding a quilt, her face full of anger and shame. Widow Lisa touched my head and smiled. "Tom, you really are a righteous man who would even kill his own mother. You knew that after your mother stole a man, she would give birth to a little brother. So you informed the uncles and aunts in the village in advance to help you catch the adulterer." I was stunned. My mother didn't steal a man. She was entangled by a snake. That snake was very big. It covered the whole bed. My mother's whole body was tightly wrapped by the snake. The village chief coughed pretentiously. "Tom, you can't talk nonsense. If your mother was entangled by such a thick snake, she would be injured if she didn't die. Look at your mother's body. Were there any injuries?" Widow Lisa stretched out her index finger and pointed at my mother's body without any shyness. "Besides, if your mother was entangled by a snake, why didn't the snake eat her, but only took off her clothes? She must have stolen a man." Among the crowd, someone laughed and said, "Like mother, like daughter. Your grandma couldn't stand the loneliness and stole a man, and now your mother can't stand the loneliness and is also stealing a man." Ha 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 ha. Everyone's laughter was extremely harsh, like needles piercing my ears. But my mother had no expression. She sat on the bed, her expression gradually becoming dull. My mother's current appearance was exactly the same as Grandma's when she was caught cheating. My heart suddenly turned cold. A terrifying thought came to my mind. Could it be that my grandma didn't steal a man, but was abused by a snake? This idea wasn't out of thin air. Couldn't the village dispute wanted grandma for stealing a man? But in fact, no one saw which old man was messing around with my grandma. What everyone saw was the scene of grandma not wearing clothes on the bed, and thus concluded that she was stealing a man. Grandma didn't refute either. Therefore, even I acquiesced, thinking that grandma had done something wrong. But now I suddenly felt that my previous thoughts were wrong. After the people in the village ridiculed my mother, they all yawned and left. I rushed to my mother and kept asking her, "Mom, why didn't you explain just now?" My mother's expression remained dull. I plucked up my courage and shouted, "Mom, do you know that you will become a laughingstock